The rain hammered against the grimy windows of the archival library like thousands of tiny fists demanding entry, but Alara barely noticed anymore. She had grown accustomed to the perpetual gloom that shrouded this forgotten corner of the city, where crumbling stone walls held secrets that nobody cared to remember. For 3 years, she had worked among these dust-covered tomes and decaying manuscripts, cataloging histories that would likely never be read again. It was quiet work, lonely work, but it was hers. At 24, she had long ago accepted that her life would be one of small moments and smaller expectations, a far cry from the adventures she had devoured in childhood fairy tales. Her fingers traced the spine of another ancient volume as she climbed the rickety ladder to the restricted section, a place she had been warned never to disturb during her initial training, though her supervisor had retired 2 years ago, and nobody had replaced him. The restricted section had called to her for months now, whispering promises of something more, something forgotten. Tonight, with the storm raging outside and the building empty except for her, she finally gave in to that call. The book practically fell into her hands, as if it had been waiting. Bound in leather so old it felt like dried skin, covered in symbols that seemed to writhe in the candlelight. It radiated a coldness that made her breath mist in the summer air. She should have put it back, should have locked the section and gone home to her small apartment and her microwave dinner, but instead she carried it down to her desk like a treasured prize. The cover bore no title, only a singular symbol that resembled an eye within a crescent moon, and when she opened it, the pages released a scent of winter frost and something else, something that made her heart ache with inexplicable longing. The text was written in multiple languages, some she recognized from her studies, and others that seemed to exist between the spaces of known tongues. But there were passages in English, translated perhaps by some long-dead scholar, and these she began to read aloud, her voice barely a whisper in the cavernous silence. The words spoke of guardians, of beings who had walked between the mortal realm and the void beyond, protecting humanity from horrors that lurked in the spaces between heartbeats. They were not quite human, these guardians, but something more ancient, something that had existed since the first humans learned to fear the dark. Among them had been a hierarchy, and at its peak stood the primordials, 7 warriors of immense power who could reshape reality with their will. But the text spoke of betrayal, of a great sealing, of sacrifice that had been deliberately erased from collective memory. Her fingers trembled as she turned the page and found an illustration that stole the breath from her lungs. A man stood at the center of a cosmic storm, his arms outstretched as reality itself seemed to tear around him. His face turned upward in an expression of such profound anguish that Alara felt tears spring to her eyes without understanding why. Beneath the image, a single name was written in script that glowed faintly even after 1,000 years. Kale, the last guardian, the forgotten protector, the sleeping king of sacrifice. She read on, compelled by a force she could not name, learning how Kale had faced an entity known only as the devourer, a being of pure entropy, that had broken through the barriers between dimensions with the sole purpose of consuming all existence. The other primordials had fallen one by one, and Kale, along with his bonded companion, a woman named Lyra, who was described as his soul-bound, his perfect other half, had made a desperate final stand. The text described how Lyra had given her life force to empower Kale for one final spell, how he had used her sacrifice and his own essence to create a prison dimension, sealing himself and the devourer away from reality itself. But the spell had been imperfect, rushed, and while the devourer was trapped in stasis, Kale was condemned to an eternity of consciousness within the prison, forever reliving the moment of Lyra's death, forever experiencing the agony of her loss in an endless loop of torment. The world had been saved, but at a cost that nobody would ever know, because those who had envied his power, who had feared what he represented, had systematically erased all record of his existence, rewriting history to claim the victory as their own. If you are drawn to stories of forgotten heroes and impossible love, make sure to hit that like button and let me know in the comments what you think happens next, because this journey is just beginning. And trust me, you will not want to miss where it goes. The final passage of the chapter she read contained what appeared to be an invocation, a string of words, in a language that felt simultaneously foreign and intimately familiar, as though she had spoken it in dreams she could not quite remember. Against every instinct of self-preservation, Alara spoke the words aloud, her voice growing stronger with each syllable. And the moment the final word left her lips, the world lurched sideways. The candles flared brilliant white, the air crackled with electricity, and a sensation like being plunged into ice water and fire simultaneously crashed through her body. She gasped, clutching the desk as her vision swam. And then, suddenly she was not in the library anymore. She stood in a vast expanse of nothing, a gray void that stretched infinitely in all directions. And in the center of this nowhere place, suspended in chains of pure light that burned with cold fire, was him. Kyle hung in the air, his body racked with tension, his face contorted in silent agony. He was beautiful in a way that transcended mere physical appearance, with features that seemed carved from marble and moonlight, dark hair that fell past his, shoulders and eyes that even in torment blazed with an inner fire of gold and silver. He wore the remnants of armor that had fused with his skin over centuries, and around him swirled fragments of memories made manifest, scenes of battle and love and loss that played out in ghostly repetition. She watched as a phantom version of a woman with flowing auburn hair and eyes like emeralds threw herself in front of Kyle, taking a blow meant for him. Watched as Kyle screamed in denial, watched as he gathered her dying form in his arms while reality shattered around them. The scene reset, played again, and again, and again, an eternal recursion of the worst moment of his existence. Alara tried to call out to him, but found she had no voice in this place. Tried to move toward him, but her feet remained rooted to the non-ground. She could only watch, tears streaming down her face, as this magnificent being suffered in isolation, forgotten by the world he had saved, tormented by the love he had lost. Then, as if sensing her presence for the first time in a millennium, Kale's eyes snapped open and focused directly on her. The chains flared brighter and he convulsed in pain, but he fought against them, his lips moving in words she could not hear, his hand reaching toward her across the impossible distance. For a heartbeat that lasted an eternity, their eyes met, and Alara felt something snap into place inside her chest, as though a piece of herself she had never known was missing had suddenly been found. Recognition flooded through her, not of his face, but of his essence, as though her soul had known his long before her mortal mind could comprehend. The vision shattered like glass, and she was back in the library, collapsed over the desk, the book fallen to the floor, her body shaking with the aftershocks of whatever had just occurred. She should have been terrified. Any rational person would have fled the building and never returned, would have convinced themselves it had been a hallucination brought on by exhaustion or illness. But Alara had never felt more awake, more alive, more certain of anything in her entire life. Kyle was real. His prison was real. His suffering was real. And somehow, impossibly, she had connected with him across the barriers of reality itself. She gathered the book with trembling hands, checking to ensure no one had witnessed her collapse, though the library remained as empty as always. The rain had stopped, she realized, and the first light of dawn was creeping through the windows, which meant she had lost hours to whatever had just transpired. Her mind raced as she carefully returned the book to the restricted section, though she knew she would return to it, knew that this was only the beginning of something that would irrevocably change the trajectory of her quiet, ordinary life. As she locked up and stepped out into the cool morning air, she pressed a hand to her chest, where warmth now radiated, a warmth that pulsed in, rhythm with a heartbeat that was not quite her own. The dreams started that very night. She would close her eyes in her small bed and find herself back in that gray void, watching Kale's torment from a distance she could never quite cross. But over the following weeks, something began to change. Her presence, her consciousness touching that prison dimension, seemed to create small disruptions in the endless cycle. Sometimes the phantom scene would freeze, just for a moment, and Kale would have a few seconds of respite before it began again. During those precious moments, he would search the void with those impossibly beautiful eyes, seeking her, and when he found her watching, he would mouth words that she slowly began to understand. Help me. Remember me. Find the key. She became obsessed, spending every waking moment researching, diving deeper into the restricted archives. Cross-referencing myths and legends from a dozen cultures, she learned that the Guardians had not completely vanished from the world, that there were still those who claimed the title, though they were shadows of what the primordials had been, more politicians and bureaucrats now than warriors, forming a council that governed supernatural affairs from their gleaming tower in the city center. She learned that this council had indeed been responsible for erasing Kale's legacy, that they had built their power structure on the foundation of his sacrifice, while denying him any recognition, painting themselves as the saviors of humanity. The more she uncovered, the more her determination solidified into something unbreakable. She would free him. She would restore his name. She would end his suffering, or die trying. The research led her to references of something called the Awakening Key, an artifact that had been shattered into 5 fragments and scattered across the world, hidden in temples that existed in the liminal spaces between the mortal realm and the supernatural. Each fragment was guarded by trials designed to test worthiness, and each location was marked by the same symbol that had been on the book's cover, the eye within the crescent moon. She found the first temple marked on an ancient map, hidden beneath the city itself, in the old catacombs that had been sealed off for decades after a collapse that was officially declared too dangerous to excavate. Make sure you are subscribed, because Alara's journey into the catacombs is going to reveal secrets that will shake everything you think you know about this world, and you definitely do not want to miss what she discovers about her own hidden heritage. She prepared for 3 weeks, gathering supplies, studying the layout from old municipal records, teaching herself the basics of self-defense from online videos, because she had no illusions about the dangers she would face. On the night she finally descended into the catacombs through a forgotten access point behind the library, Alara carried a backpack filled with flashlights, rope, first aid supplies, and the ancient book carefully wrapped in protective cloth. The tunnels beneath the city were a maze of crumbling brick and limestone, the air thick with moisture and the scent of earth and decay. She navigated by the map she had memorized, marking her path with chalk so she could find her way back, her heart pounding with equal parts fear and exhilaration. Hours of walking through the oppressive darkness brought her to a section of wall that should not have existed according to the city plans, a seamless expanse of black stone covered in the same symbols from the book. When she pressed her hand against the central eye symbol, the wall shimmered like a heat mirage and dissolved, revealing a passage that descended steeply into depths that predated the city above by centuries. The temple chamber at the bottom took her breath away. It was vast and circular, the walls covered in murals depicting the 7 primordials in their glory, and at the center stood a pedestal holding a crystalline fragment that pulsed with inner light. But between her and the pedestal, the air itself seemed to thicken and take shape, forming into a creature that defied easy description. It had too many limbs, too many eyes, a body that shifted between forms as though it could not decide what shape to wear. This was the Guardian, the trial she would have to pass. It spoke in a voice like grinding stone, asking her a question that resonated in her bones. What do you sacrifice for love? What would you give to ease another's pain? Would you trade your peace for his torment, your freedom for his prison, your life for his awakening? Alara did not hesitate, even as every survival instinct screamed at her to run. She answered with the truth that burned in her heart, that she would give anything, everything, that she had already sacrificed her normal life the moment she had seen his suffering, that her peace was already forfeit because she could not rest, knowing he remained in agony, that her freedom was meaningless if he remained chained, and that her life had found its purpose in seeking his liberation. The words poured from her like a confession, like a vow, and as she spoke, she felt something awaken within her own body, a warmth that spread from her core outward, manifesting as a soft golden glow that emanated from her skin. The guardian creature regarded her with its multitude of eyes, Then slowly, it bowed, its form dissipating like smoke, and the path to the pedestal cleared. She approached on trembling legs and took the first fragment in her hands, feeling it hum with recognition, as though it had been waiting specifically for her touch. The moment her fingers closed around it, her vision went white, and she was thrust back into Cale's prison. This time she was closer to him than ever before, close enough to see the individual scars that marked his skin, close enough to see the way his chest heaved with each labored breath, close enough to see the tears that tracked down his face as the phantom scene of Lyra's death played out once more. But this time, when it reset, there was a longer pause, nearly a full minute of respite, and during that minute, Cale's awareness focused entirely on her. He spoke, and though his voice was rough from disuse, it was the most beautiful sound she had ever heard, a deep resonance that vibrated through her very soul. "You came," he said, wonder and disbelief coloring his tone. "You heard my call across the void. Who are you? How is this possible?" She found her voice worked here now, strengthened perhaps by the fragment she had claimed. "My name is Alara, and I found the book that remembered you when the world forgot. I am going to free you, Cale. I swear it." His eyes, those incredible eyes of molten gold and silver, searched her face as though memorizing every detail, and she saw something shift in their depths, the tiniest spark of hope kindling in the darkness of his. "Despair. You cannot understand what you are attempting," he said, his voice breaking. "The trials will demand everything from you. The fragments are protected by magic designed to break the unworthy, and even if you succeed, even if you gather all 5 pieces and forge the key, opening my prison will release not just me, but the echo of the devourer's essence, a remnant powerful enough to threaten this world all over again." The council sealed away the knowledge of how to properly complete the original spell, ensured that no one would ever be able to replicate what I did. Freeing me could doom everything. She stepped closer, wishing she could touch him, wishing she could ease his pain even for a moment. "Then we will face it together," she said, with a conviction that surprised even herself. "You sacrificed everything alone. You suffered alone for 1,000 years. You will not face this alone anymore. I do not fully understand why I feel this connection to you, why my heart recognizes yours, why my soul seems to have been searching for you my entire life without knowing what it sought, but I know this is real. You are real. Your pain is real, and you deserve to be free." Tears flowed freely down his face now, the first tears in centuries that were not born purely of anguish, but of something else, something fragile and precious. Hope, gratitude, connection. Before he could respond, the scene of Lyra's death began to play again, and Alara was wrenched back to the temple chamber, gasping as she clutched the fragment to her chest. The journey back to the surface took twice as long as the descent, her body exhausted, and her mind reeling from the intensity of the connection she had experienced. But she made it back to her apartment as the sun rose, collapsing onto her bed fully clothed. She dreamed of him that day, but this time the dreams were different. Instead of only witnessing his torment, she found herself walking with him through memories of his past, seeing the world as it had been before the devourer, seeing him laughing with his fellow primordials, seeing the moment he first met Lyra, and how the recognition between them had been instant and absolute, a mirror of what Alara herself had felt upon first seeing him. The second fragment was located across the ocean, in the ruins of a temple complex in Southeast Asia that had been abandoned after being swallowed by jungle centuries ago. Alara used her savings to book a flight, calling in sick to work for the first time in her 3-year tenure, knowing she was burning bridges but unable to care. Nothing mattered except the quest. Nothing mattered except freeing him. The jungle was brutal, the humidity oppressive, the insects relentless, but she hired a local guide to take her to the general region, and then ventured alone into the ruins when he refused to go further, citing local legends of spirits that drove men mad. She found the temple by following the pull of the first fragment, which seemed to resonate when pointed in the right direction, like a compass seeking true north. This temple had partially collapsed, its stones covered in creeping vines and moss. But the chamber beneath remained intact, accessed through a shaft that required her to rappel down using equipment she barely knew how to operate properly. Comment below if you have ever felt a connection to someone that defied all logic and reason, because what Alara is experiencing with Kale goes beyond anything that can be explained by normal means. And I want to know if you believe in this kind of soul-deep recognition. The second guardian took the form of a massive serpent made of living water, its body constantly flowing and reforming, its eyes like whirlpools. It posed a different question. What do you fear? What nightmare keeps you from peace? Will you face the darkness within yourself to earn the light you seek? The trial it imposed was psychological rather than physical, plunging Alara into a vision of her deepest fears. She saw herself failing, saw Kale's hope extinguishing as she proved too weak to complete the quest, saw him condemned to eternal torment because of her inadequacy, saw herself dying alone and forgotten just like him, her efforts meaningless, her sacrifice wasted. She saw versions of herself giving up, turning back, choosing the safe and easy path of her old life. But she also saw the truth beneath the fears, saw that she had already changed too much to ever go back, that she was no longer the woman who had settled for a quiet existence in a forgotten library. She confronted each fear, acknowledged it, and then released it, understanding that fear itself was not weakness, but what she chose to do, despite the fear that defined her strength. The water serpent dissolved into mist, and the second fragment rose from the pool at the chamber's center, this one glowing with a blue-white light that felt cool against her skin. The vision with Kale that followed was longer this time, nearly 5 minutes of respite from his cycle of torment, and they spoke about her life, about the world that had forgotten him, about the changes that had occurred over the centuries. He was hungry for knowledge, for connection, for proof that the world he had saved still existed, and she gave him everything she could, describing the modern age with all its wonders and horrors, telling him about her own small life, and how it had been transformed by finding him. You speak of yourself as ordinary, he said, studying her with an intensity that made her feel seen in a way she never had before. But there is nothing ordinary about you, Alara. The fragments respond to you. The trials accept you, and you carry within yourself a light that I have not seen since the age of the primordials. There is magic in your blood, old magic, dormant perhaps, but present nonetheless. His words sparked something in her memory, a comment her grandmother had made shortly before her death, something about their family line being descended from temple priestesses who had served as bridges between worlds. She had dismissed it as the rambling of an old woman succumbing to dementia, but now she wondered if there had been truth in those words, if her ability to connect with Kale was not random chance, but inherited potential, finally awakening. The third fragment proved the most dangerous to obtain, located in the frozen wastes of the Arctic, within a structure that existed partially phased out of normal reality, visible only during the aurora borealis, and accessible only to those who could perceive the supernatural. She nearly died 3 times during that retrieval, once from hypothermia when her equipment failed, once from falling through ice that should have been solid, and once from the Guardian itself, a being of living ice and ancient hunger that tested her endurance and will to survive. The question it posed was simple, but brutal. How much pain will you endure? At what point does survival become more important than purpose? It subjected her to cold that burned, to exhaustion that made every movement agony, to hallucinations of warmth and safety if she would only abandon the fragment and leave. She endured by focusing on Kale's face, on the memory of his voice, on the knowledge that whatever she suffered was nothing compared to what he had endured for a millennium. When she finally emerged from that temple, the third fragment clutched in her frostbitten hands. She collapsed in the snow and wept, her body pushed beyond limits she had not known she possessed. The vision with Kale that followed was different in a crucial way. This time, when the cycle of Lyra's death began to play, Kale did not simply endure it. He turned away from the phantom scene and focused entirely on Alara, using her presence as an anchor to resist the pull of the torment. And for the first time in 1,000 years, the scene faltered, skipped, and reset without him being forced to watch every agonizing detail. "You are changing the nature of the prison itself," he said, a mixture of awe and fear in his voice. "Your presence, your determination, it is creating cracks in the spell structure, but you must understand what that means. When you free me, if you succeed in gathering all 5 fragments, the prison will shatter completely. The devourer is held in stasis by the same magic that binds me. Its essence will be released and even diminished after all these centuries. It will be powerful enough to destroy this city, perhaps more. Then we will be ready," Ilara said, though she had no idea how they could possibly prepare for such a threat. "You are the last guardian. You defeated it once. You can do so again, and this time you will not be alone. You will have me, and we will find others. We will make the council acknowledge the truth and stand with us." His expression was filled with doubt, but also with something that looked dangerously close to the emotion she was beginning to recognize in her own heart. "You have more faith in me than I have in myself," he said softly. "I am not the warrior I was. 1,000 years of torment have broken parts of me that may never heal. I do not know if I have the strength to face that entity again." "Then I will be your strength," she replied, and she meant it with every fiber of her being. She was no longer doing this just to free him, she realized. She was doing it because somewhere along this impossible journey, she had fallen in love with him, with his pain and his courage, with his sacrifice and his enduring hope, with the way he looked at her, as though she was the first light he had seen after an eternity of darkness. The 4th fragment was hidden in plain sight, in a museum in her own city, disguised as part of a mundane archaeological exhibit. Finding it required no physical journey, but instead a different kind of trial, one of patience and careful planning. She volunteered at the museum, worked there for weeks to gain trust and access, studied the security systems and guard rotations, and finally, on a night when she worked the late shift alone in the archives, she located the fragment tucked away in a storage box, mislabeled and forgotten. The guardian here was not a creature but a test of conscience. Taking the fragment without permission was theft, was a betrayal of the trust the museum had placed in her, was a violation of the law. The fragment itself posed the question: what laws will you break for? Love? What lines will you cross? At what point does the end cease to justify the means? She held the fragment in her hands, feeling the weight of the choice, understanding that this marked her as a criminal, as someone who had chosen a personal quest over societal rules. If you are loving this story, hit that subscribe button now, because the next part is going to blow your mind when Ilara discovers the shocking truth about the council and the real reason they erased Kale from history. She took it, accepting the consequences, understanding that some rules were worth breaking when weighed against the suffering of an innocent being condemned to eternal torture for saving the world. The museum would survive the loss of one unidentified artifact. Kyle would not survive another 1,000 years of his imprisonment. The vision that night was the longest yet, nearly 15 minutes of freedom from the cycle, and Kale wept openly as he told her about Lyra, about how they had been bonded since childhood, how their souls had been intertwined in a way that transcended normal love, how losing her had been like losing half of himself. "I thought I would never feel anything like that again," he said, his voice raw with emotion. "I thought that part of me died with her, that I was destined to exist only in grief and regret. But then you appeared, impossible and real, and I feel something I have no right to feel, something that shames me because it feels like a betrayal of her memory." Ilara understood, even though it hurt. She had fallen in love with a man who was still in love with a woman who had been dead for a millennium, a woman who had been his perfect other half, his soul-bound. How could she compete with that? How could she ask him to move beyond a love that had literally transcended death? But when she voiced these thoughts, Kale reached toward her, and though they still could not touch across the dimensional barrier, she felt the intention behind the gesture, Lyra would not want me to suffer forever, he said. She gave her life so that I might save the world, so that existence itself could continue, and that includes the possibility of new connections, new love, new purpose. I do not know what this feeling is between us, whether it is simply gratitude on my part or something deeper, whether you are drawn to me as I truly am or to the idea of saving me, but I know that it is real, and it is precious, and I do not want to lose it, even if I do not fully understand it yet. His honesty broke something open inside her, and she found herself telling him everything, about how her life had been empty before finding him, about how she had been merely existing rather than truly living, about how saving him had given her purpose, but knowing him had given her something more, something she was afraid to name because it seemed absurd to love someone she had never actually touched, never stood beside in the real world, never experienced life with, beyond these stolen moments in a prison dimension. The fifth and final fragment was the most difficult to locate because the records had been deliberately obscured, but after weeks of research and several dangerous encounters with lower-level guardians who had noticed her activities and attempted to stop her, she finally traced it to the Council's own headquarters. It was hidden in their vault, kept as a trophy, proof that they had successfully prevented anyone from ever freeing Kyle and exposing their lies. Getting inside required her to infiltrate the building during a public event, to use her knowledge of old architecture, to find maintenance passages that led to the lower levels, to bypass supernatural wards using techniques she had learned from the ancient book, and to face down the vault's protections, which included not just technology, but layers of magical barriers designed to repel intruders. The final guardian was the most terrifying of all, a manifestation of the Council's collective will, taking the form of a being of pure authority and judgment. It asked the question that cut to the heart of everything. Who are you to decide his fate? Who are you to risk the world for one life? What gives you the right to overturn the judgment of those wiser and more powerful than yourself? Alara stood before this manifestation of institutional power and spoke her truth. I am someone who read the forgotten history and learned that wisdom and power do not always align with justice and compassion. I am someone who saw an innocent being suffering for a sacrifice he chose to make, and decided that no one deserves eternal torment, regardless of what the powerful have decreed. I am someone who believes that one life, any life, especially one that saved countless others, has value worth fighting for. I am no one special, no one important, just a woman who worked in a library and stumbled upon a truth that had been buried. But that is exactly who should be making this choice. Not the powerful, not the authority figures, but an ordinary person who still has the capacity to see injustice and choose to oppose it. The Guardian regarded her in silence, and for a long moment she thought it would reject her, would destroy her for her presumption. But then it stepped aside, dissolving into light, and the vault door swung open, revealing the fifth fragment resting on a pedestal of black marble, pulsing with a light that seemed to contain all colors and none, simultaneously. The moment she touched it, alarms shrieked throughout the building, and she knew her time had run out. Guards, both human and supernatural, would be converging on her location within seconds. She had prepared for this, had known that taking this final piece would expose her completely, would mark her as an enemy of the Council and a criminal in the eyes of both mundane and supernatural law. She clutched all 5 fragments to her chest, feeling them begin to resonate with each other, pulling together with magnetic force. And she spoke the words from the book, the incantation of joining, her voice rising above the alarms. The fragments melted and flowed like liquid light, merging and reforming, taking the shape of an actual key, a physical object of impossible beauty that seemed to exist slightly outside of normal reality. Its edges blurred as though she was seeing it through water. Power surged through her as she held it, and she understood now what Kale had meant, about magic in her blood. This was not something just anyone could have done. The fragments had required someone with the old bloodline, someone descended from the temple priestesses who had served the primordials, someone whose very essence could bridge the gap between worlds. Guards burst into the vault just as she vanished, using the key itself as a focus to transport herself to the one place she needed to be, the one place the key was designed to open. She materialized in the gray void of Kale's prison, stumbling and nearly falling, but managing to keep her feet. Kale hung in his chains as always, but the cycle had stopped completely, frozen at the moment just before Lyra's death, and his eyes were locked on Alara with an intensity that made her feel like she might burn up from the inside. "You did it," he breathed, his voice filled with wonder and terror. "You actually did it. But Alara, you need to know what will happen. The moment you use that key, the moment my chains break, the more containment will fail, and the devourer's echo will manifest. It will come through me, will use my body as a conduit, because I am still connected to it through the original spell. You will have to fight me, will have to subdue me while I battle it from within, and I do not know if I am strong enough to maintain control. If I fail, if it takes me completely even for a moment, I could kill you without meaning to." She walked toward him, the key glowing brighter with each step, and when she was close, enough to see the individual flecks of gold in his silver eyes, she smiled even though she was terrified. "Then you had better not fail," she said, and she pressed the key into the lock that existed at the center of his chains, a lock that had been invisible until the key made it manifest. The key turned with a sound like reality itself, sighing, and the chains exploded into fragments of light that dissipated like stars going supernova. Kyle fell, and Alara caught him, or tried to. Both of them, collapsing to the non-ground of the void prison as it began to shake and crack around them. He was solid in her arms for the first time, real and warm and trembling. And for one perfect heartbeat, they simply held each other. 1,000 years of isolation, meeting a lifetime of loneliness in an embrace that felt like coming home. Then Kale screamed, his body convulsing, and darkness began to pour from him like smoke, coalescing into a shape that towered over them both. A shadow with too many eyes, and mouths that smiled with malice and hunger. The devourer's echo was not as powerful as the original entity had been, but it was still a force of destruction, and it spoke with a voice that resonated with the void itself, promising obliteration and entropy, reaching for Alara with appendages that seemed to be made of solidified nothingness. Kyle fought it from within. She could see the struggle in his eyes, in the way his body moved against his will, in the way his hands reached for her throat, even as he screamed at her to run. She did not run. Instead, she placed her hands on his face, feeling the magic in her blood surge to the surface, that dormant power of her ancestors finally fully awakening, and she poured it into him, not as an attack, but as a reinforcement, as light to combat the darkness, as connection to anchor him against the pull of the entity that sought to control him. She spoke to him, her voice cutting through the chaos, reminding him of who he was, of everything he had endured, of the reason he had fought in the first place. "You are Kale, last of the primordials, guardian of the threshold, and you do not serve the darkness. You conquered it once, and you will conquer it again. And I am here. I am with you. You are not alone." Something shifted in him, a resistance solidifying, and when his hands closed around her throat, it was not to squeeze but to hold, and golden light began to emanate from his skin, pushing back against the shadow. The battle was not quick or easy. It raged for what felt like hours, but might have been moments, the void prison shattering around them in pieces, reality bleeding through in glimpses of the normal world. And all the while, Alara held on to him, anchoring him with her presence, with her power, with her absolute refusal to let him be consumed by the very thing he had sacrificed everything to defeat. Finally, with a roar that shook the foundations of existence, Kale gathered all his remaining strength, all the power that had made him a primordial, and combined it with the light Alara was channeling through him, and together they burned the devourer's echo out of existence, reducing it to less than memory, to true and absolute nothing. The void prison collapsed entirely, and they fell through layers of reality, tumbling through the spaces between dimensions, until they crashed down onto solid ground in a tangle of limbs and ragged breathing. They were back in the real world, in the ruins of the council. headquarters vault, which had been torn apart by the dimensional energies of the prison's collapse. Alarms still wailed, fires burned, and shouts echoed from above. But for a moment, none of that mattered, because Cale was free, truly free, lying on the ground gasping for breath. His chains gone, the curse broken, and Alara was beside him, exhausted and battered but alive and victorious. He turned his head to look at her, and she saw him truly for the first time in full reality rather than through a dimensional barrier, saw the way the light caught in his hair, the precise color of his skin, the exact shape of his lips, and he was even more beautiful than she had imagined. They stared at each other for a long moment, and then simultaneously, they began to laugh, the kind of slightly hysterical laughter that comes after surviving the impossible, after achieving what should have been unachievable. The laughter faded into something else, something softer and more intense. And when he cupped her face in his hands that were trembling with emotion and exhaustion, and asked without words if he could kiss her, she answered by closing the distance between them herself. The kiss was everything and nothing like she had imagined. Tentative at first, because this was his first real touch in a millennium, his first moment of physical connection with someone who was not a phantom or a memory, and then deepening into something that spoke of gratitude and wonder and the beginning of something that might become love if they gave it time to grow. When they finally broke apart, still holding each other as though afraid this might be another illusion, they became aware of the figures surrounding them, council members and guards, all staring in shock at the impossible sight of the last guardian returned from his eternal prison. The head counselor, a severe woman with silver hair and eyes like chips of ice, stepped forward, her expression caught between fury and fear. "What have, you done?" she demanded, her voice shaking. "Do you have any idea what you have unleashed? The protocols exist for a reason. He was sealed away to protect the world, and you have undone 1,000 years of careful containment." Cale rose to his feet, pulling Alara up with him, and when he spoke, his voice carried the weight of ages, the authority of one who had held the line against the end of all things. "You sealed me away to protect your own power," he said, each word precise and cutting. "You erased my sacrifice from history so you could claim it as your own, built your council on the foundation of my suffering while denying me even the recognition of what I had done. The devourer is gone, truly gone now, destroyed rather than merely contained. Alara freed me, and together we finished what I started a millennium ago. Your protocols, your careful containment, they were nothing more than a prison for an innocent who had saved you all, and your lies end today." The confrontation that followed was tense and complicated, accusations and counter-accusations flying, threats of imprisonment for both Cale and Alara, demands that he submit to council authority, his refusal delivered with a quiet strength that made it clear he would never again allow himself to be controlled by those who valued power over justice. In the end, it was the presence of junior council members, those who had not been part of the original conspiracy, who tipped the balance, demanding answers about the historical inconsistencies they had always wondered about, demanding proof of the claims being made on both sides. When Alara produced the ancient book and began to read from it, when she showed them the records she had compiled, when she demonstrated the magic in her own blood that proved her descent from the temple priestesses who had served in the age of the primordials, doubt began to crack the unified front of the council's authority. A formal investigation was called. Records were unsealed, that had been hidden for centuries, and slowly, painfully, the truth began to emerge. Cale's name was restored, his sacrifice acknowledged, and the council was forced to undergo massive reforms, with several of the oldest members stepping down in disgrace or facing supernatural justice for their roles in the historical falsification. Through it all, Cale and Alara remained together, navigating the chaos of his return to a world that had changed beyond recognition, dealing with the trauma he carried from his imprisonment, learning how to build a relationship in reality rather than stolen moments in a prison dimension. It was not always easy. There were nights when he woke screaming from nightmares of Lyra's death, Days when the weight of 1,000 years pressed down on him so heavily he could barely move. Moments when Alara doubted whether she was truly what he needed, or if she was just a convenient anchor in his overwhelming adjustment to freedom. But they worked through it, with honesty and patience, and the help of healers who specialized in trauma, both mundane therapists and supernatural guides who understood the unique nature of his experience. They learned each other in the small ways that mattered: favorite foods and morning routines, the way he liked his coffee and the way she hummed while working, the fact that he was terrible at using modern technology, and she was surprisingly good at the old combat forms he taught her. 6 months after his liberation, Kale took Alara to a place that existed outside normal geography, a sanctuary that the primordials had created as a refuge, a place that had waited empty for a millennium for its guardians to return. It was beautiful beyond description, a valley where reality worked slightly differently, where time flowed at whatever pace its inhabitants desired, where the barriers between the mortal and supernatural were thin enough to walk through like curtains. He had been working on rebuilding it, making it a home, rather than just a monument to the lost, and he wanted to share it with her, wanted to know if she could see herself living there with him, building a life in this place between worlds. She walked through gardens that bloomed with flowers that sang, past pools that reflected not what was, but what might be, and she turned to him with tears in her eyes and told him that she could see herself anywhere as long as he was there, that home had stopped being a place and had become a person the moment. She had first seen him suffering in his chains. He proposed to her in that garden, not with a ring because such things meant little to one who had existed for millennia, but with a bond, a magical intertwining of their essences that was the way primordials had always committed to their chosen partners, a bond that would allow them to sense each other's emotions, to find each other across any distance, to share in each other's joys and sorrows on a level deeper than words could express. It was not the same as the soul-bound connection he had shared with Lyra. He was careful to explain. That was something that occurred perhaps once in 1,000 lifetimes, something that could not be replicated or replaced, but this was its own kind of magic, chosen rather than destined, built rather than discovered, and in some ways that made it even more precious, because it represented a conscious decision to intertwine their futures. She accepted, feeling the bond settle into place like a warmth in her chest, a constant awareness of him that was comforting rather than intrusive. And they sealed the commitment in the traditional way, with words spoken in the old language and magic that flared bright enough to illuminate the entire valley. The world continued to change around them. The council reformed under new leadership that actually deserved the title of guardians. New recruits were trained not just in combat, but in the ethics and philosophy of protection. And Kale took a role as an advisor and teacher, passing on the knowledge of the primordials to a generation that had grown up knowing only pale shadows of what guardianship had once meant. Alara became the head of a new initiative to recover and preserve accurate supernatural history, to ensure that no more heroes would be erased and forgotten, that the truth would be protected, even when it was inconvenient for those in power. They worked together to build something better than what had existed before, using his experience and her determination to create systems that valued justice and compassion alongside strength and duty. They were happy, genuinely happy, in a way that felt earned rather than given, built through trials and choices, and the conscious decision to choose each other every day. 3 years after Kale's liberation, Alara discovered she was pregnant, something that should have been impossible according to everything known about primordials and human compatibility. But their bond had changed, her on a fundamental level, awakening not just her dormant magic, but transforming her into something more than purely human, a bridge between mortal and eternal. The child, when she was born, was extraordinary, carrying the best of both her parents, Kale's strength and magic combined with Alara's humanity and compassion. And they named her Lyra, not as a replacement or a way to hold on to the past, but as an honoring of the sacrifice that had made all of this possible, a recognition that love in all its forms, past and present, contributed to the beautiful complexity of their lives. Kyle wept when he held his daughter for the first time. tears of joy rather than grief. And Alara knew in that moment that he had finally, truly healed, that he had found a way to carry his past without being crushed by it, to honor what he had lost while embracing what he had found. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who believes in the power of love to transcend even the greatest barriers. And do not forget to subscribe for more stories that explore the depths of emotion and the triumph of hope over despair. The epilogue to their story would be written over decades and centuries, because Alara's transformation meant she would age far more slowly than a normal human, giving them time that most couples could never dream of having. They watched the world change, guided new generations of guardians, protected humanity from threats both mundane and supernatural, and, through it all, they remained each other's anchor and inspiration. The library where Alara had once worked alone and forgotten became a museum dedicated to the true history of the Guardians, with the ancient book that had started everything displayed in a place of honor, a reminder that sometimes the most important truths are found in the places everyone has forgotten to look. Kyle never forgot the 1,000 years he had spent in torment. The memories remained vivid and painful, but they know. Longer defined him. They were part of his story, but not the whole of it. He had learned that healing was not about erasing the past, but about refusing to let it consume the future, and that love, real love, the kind that was built through choice and effort and mutual support, could be just as powerful as the destined connection he had lost. He had learned this from Alara, from her stubborn refusal to abandon him, from her courage in facing impossible trials, from her faith that he was worth saving even when he had lost faith in himself. She had given him back his life, and in return, he had given her a purpose greater than anything she had imagined possible, had shown her that she was extraordinary not despite her ordinariness, but because of it, because she had chosen to be extraordinary through her actions. Their daughter grew up surrounded by love and magic, learning from her father the ways of the primordials, and from her mother the value of compassion and justice, and she would eventually take her own place as a guardian, a bridge between the old ways and the new, carrying forward the legacy of sacrifice and hope that had defined her parents' love story. The world never forgot Kale again. His name was restored to every history. His sacrifice taught to every new guardian. His example held up as the standard of what it meant to truly protect others. But more importantly, he was no longer alone, no longer forgotten, no longer suffering. He had been given a second chance, at life, at love, at happiness, and he seized it with both hands, living each day with the awareness of how precious it was, how easily it could have been lost, how miraculous it was that a woman working in a forgotten library had cared enough about a suffering stranger to risk everything to save him, and Alara, who had once thought her life would be small and unremarkable, who had accepted a future of quiet loneliness, had discovered that love could find you in the most unexpected places, that courage was not the absence of fear, but the choice to act despite it, and that sometimes the most important thing you could do was refuse to accept that suffering was inevitable or that injustice was unchangeable. She had saved him, yes, but he had saved her too, had given her a reason to be brave, a purpose worth fighting for, a love worth crossing dimensional barriers to claim. Together, they had proved that the world had been wrong to forget, wrong to imprison, wrong to believe that one person could not make a difference. And their story became a legend told for generations, a reminder that even in the darkest prisons, even after 1,000 years of suffering, hope could survive if someone cared enough to nurture it, and love could triumph if someone was brave enough to fight for it. The world forgot the sleeping guardian, but her heart never did. And because she remembered, because she refused to let him suffer alone in the darkness, both of them found a future brighter than either had dared to imagine, a love that transcended time and dimension and death itself, proving that sometimes the most powerful magic of all is the simple, stubborn refusal to give up on someone who has given up on themselves, the choice to see worth in those the world has discarded, and the courage to believe that broken things can be made whole again if you are willing to hold them together, until they heal. Their story ended not with a dramatic finale, but with the quiet contentment of two. People who had found each other against impossible odds and chose to build a life together one day at a time, surrounded by family and purpose, and the knowledge that they had changed the world simply by refusing to accept that suffering had to be forever, that love could not conquer even the darkest magic, and that one person, one ordinary person with an extraordinary heart, could make all the difference.